the floor to Naidoo, really the chair of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And Jay will give us some information on innovation to empower women and families. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And well, Tony, I don't know what I'm doing here because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an economist. I'm actually an old ex-trade union organizer. So I feel a bit out of place here. But I do have a few thoughts about change. And having been an anti-apartheid activist, you know, that's a photograph of me at 2 years old. And the next photograph was in the 20s. In those days, we never had mobile phones with cameras. And listening to Minister Tedros this morning, I was struck by a conversation we had when I was in the Mandela cabinet as the Minister of Telecommunications in 1996. And we faced a similar challenge in Africa, that sub-Saharan Africa had less telephones than the city of New York or the city of Tokyo. And if we analyzed what were the problems of African connectivity, we understood that it was our problem that we had to solve. And so we convened a meeting. No one convened us. We convened the meeting of African telecommunication ministers in Cape Town in 1996. And we sat down to say, what are we doing wrong before we go out into the world and ask the world to support us? And I think that was an important lesson. And we asked ourselves, what were those roadblocks that were stopping us making the progress that many parts of the world were making? And the problem was not technical. It was navigating a political minefield of regulation, policy, and law, and the harmonization of the spectrum, which telecommunications would have needed in Africa. And that's what we did. We conceived an idea of a plan that saw us building regional hubs to build the critical mass that will attract private sector investment. Because telecommunications was being driven by private sector investment. But we had to ensure that the laws, the regulations, the policies would offer private investors the type of protection and about the safety of their investment or the return on capital. We had to understand how we had to harmonize the use of a spectrum. We had to understand how we would finance telecommunications and what was our concept of universal service. And so, if we looked at the issues then, no, I don't have one on me. So, if we look at the situation today, Africa is probably the fastest growing telecommunications market in the world. If one looks at the issues of mobile banking today, at the cutting edge of mobile telephony, it's African countries like Kenya that lead through the M-Pesa system. If one, later on today, you would be listening to something called the U campaign. It's the use of mobile telecommunications by civil society groups to ensure accountability by government to the commitments they are making in this roadmap around child survival. So there are enormous role models out there in Africa. What is missing is a marketplace that connects the donors and investment to opportunities that entrepreneurs who are creating solutions that help us achieve our objectives. And so my hope is that the roadmap will create a direct link between investors and people that are creating innovative solutions at the coalface within continents such as Africa, where the greatest problem exists today of child survival. And so what we need to do is remove the gatekeepers, what I call, friendly terms, the merchant class of poverty that we have in the world, that today absorbs so much of the resources that could be saving lives out there at the coalface. So what we have to ask ourselves is, what are the game changers? In telecommunications, it was very easy to understand that. It was a prepaid card that allowed an individual to decide how much they wanted to spend on a telecommunications service. So what are the right questions to ask ourselves today as to what are the game changers today in achieving the targets that we've talked about earlier. And it goes back to the issue of, that was me at 2 years old. At 4 years old, we were evicted from our home because of the color of our skin and the Group Areas Act. So I was a very angry young man. And I went as a young teenager to a meeting convened by the South African Students' Organization and a great charismatic leader called Steve Biko. And he spoke about us not being bystanders in a game where our futures were being decided. And that convinced many of us to take up the challenge of fighting for our freedom. And that's what we did, that we became the game changers. Today, when I talk to many civil society groups, they ask me, well, we don't have a budget to have a meeting or to launch a campaign. And I go back to our own history in the freedom struggles that we fought in Africa and say we never considered that there would be a generous donor out there waiting to pay for us to run a campaign on advocacy. So these are things that we've got to change within our own minds about how do we achieve the goals that we set ourselves. And so I asked myself the question, which are the two groups that really should be in this room today as part of this conversation? Because people like myself and Tony, maybe, we shift the age categories more to the upper ends. And I look at other campaigns that have succeeded. The global campaign around HIV and AIDS was an ability of young people and activists that combined with sympathetic governments and concerned governments and donors who were committed to doing something to create an extraordinary moment that brought us together, in spite of the difficulties that the minister raised, to make a dramatic breakthrough. And that's what we're asking for. What is that big idea that captures the attention of not just ourselves, but of the next generation who bear the consequences of decisions we have made? And today, as Tony had talked yesterday about the use of social media tools, it's that generation that will change the lives of people today that suffer as a consequence of diseases and the challenges of disease in our continent. So I want to go back to that issue of how do we bring young people into this conversation? And secondly, and most importantly, how do we bring women into the center of this conversation? Because if one takes Africa as an example, 80% of our food is produced by our mothers, by women. Yet they access 10% of extension services. They own 1% of the land. And so if we are looking at making changes and dramatic changes, we need to look at the issue of the empowerment of women, the rights of women, the incomes of women, and to address fundamentally the roadblocks, whether that is tradition, whether that is gender, whether that is religion, whether that is culture, that those things cannot be roadblocks anymore to the progress that we need to see. Because healthier mothers produce healthier children. And the data that shows us today that if one equalizes gender status, in South Asia, for example, the rate of underweight children under age 3 reduces by approximately 12 percentage points, meaning that 13.4 million fewer children will face malnourishment. So these are issues that I think we need to bring into the center of our political narrative. Now, one example of what we see happening in the organization I chair, called the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. In Bangladesh, the incidence of anemia and micronutrient deficiencies are probably 70 to 80% of women and children under 5. Working with a company called Renata, a pharmaceutical company, and with BRAC, which is a big social organization, we were able to produce a box of sprinkles which contains 15 micronutrients, which is dispensed through the network of BRAC and their 65,000 health workers for $1 a month, and which contributes up to 1/3 of the required daily allowance that a child would need. So we can find a way to work with private sector companies. We can find a way to harness the markets in a way that meets the needs of the poor. Because if one looks at the malnutrition challenge that has been reflected on quite often in the discussions over the last 2 days, that malnutrition challenge is a big part of the disease burden that leads to infant and maternal mortality. So as we're looking at scaling up the roadmap around child survival, let us also find a way of linking that roadmap to the roadmap around scaling up nutrition. That these two things are part of one program and roadmap. And I'm hoping that under your leadership, Tony, that we will be fearless, that we will be courageous in challenging those roadblocks today that hold us back. So we have agreed a global governance framework here today. We have to make some really tough choices about it. But we need to prioritize those high-impact interventions and scale them up. Our support needs to go to countries where there is demonstrable political will and commitment. And that support has to encourage, fundamentally, a robust, independent civil society that can change social behaviors of whether it is mothers, whether it is fathers, or whether it is the corporate sector or our governments. Because ultimately, it is that approach where we are able to cut through the political minefield that we will achieve what we have set as very noble goals and intentions in our meeting over the last 2 days. Thank you very much.